Hi, I'm Josh Apter, founder of Manhattan Edit Workshop, and I want to welcome you to the next edition of Sight, Sound, and Story. Tonight, we're going behind the lens, capturing Western films. This is going to be a deep dive into the shooting of modern Westerns of The Harder They Fall with cinematographer Mihai Malaimare Jr. and Old Henry with cinematographer John Matyśiak. I want to thank you for supporting our event series since we've shifted online, and of course, we're looking forward to doing more with eventually having them back in person. I also want to thank our sponsors, OWC, American Cinema Editors, ZEISS, AJA, and Filmmaker U, without whom none of this would be possible. And finally, I want to thank the folks behind tonight's event, Mike Valinsky, McKinley Sullivan, Ranager Hans, Vika Safragina, and Janet Dalton, and of course, Jason Banky from Manhattan Edit Workshop. Thanks for making it look easy, guys. As always, I say this with online events, we might have some technical problems, but we might not. So if anything happens, we'll fix it as soon as we can. Please be patient if we encounter anything. So I'd like to hand over the mic to Sean Weiner, who's the director of the Creative Culture Program at the Jacob Burns Film Center. Have a great event.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sight, Sound, and Story. Today we have two wonderful guests, two incredible cinematographers who are both exploring the Western in really wildly different ways. And I think we'll dig into different ways of visualizing the Western and of course their process. And while I'm not an overly technical person, I'm sure we'll hear a lot about technical elements as well as we're exploring different shots and camera moves and spec choices going on. I want to start by introducing our guests. I'll start by actually introducing myself. My name is Sean Weiner, and I'm the Director of Programs at the Media Arts Lab at the Jacob Burns Film Center. And today we're joined by two guests. Mihai Malaimare Jr. is a native of Romania. He began his film career after attending the prestigious National University of Theatre and Film in Bucharest. He shot a handful of award-winning shorts and feature films in Romania before auditioning with Francis Ford Coppola to shoot his film Youth Without Youth. He won the coveted role of cinematographer for that film at the age of 29 and went on to receive a Best Cinematography nomination at the Independent Spirit Awards for his work. That film put him on the map in the United States, and shortly thereafter, he was named to Variety's prestigious 10 Cinematographers to Watch in 2007. Since then, he has shot two more films with Coppola, as well as Paul Thomas Anderson's breathtakingly beautiful The Master. His latest film, a Western by James Samuel, The Harder They Fall, is a film of his that we will focus on today. And so welcome, Mihai. And our second guest, thank you for being here. Our second guest, John Matyśiak, is a third-generation Polish immigrant and born of third-generation Polish immigrants and raised in Houston, Texas. Graduated from Emerson College in Boston with a BA in film production. In addition to study at Emerson, he was selected to study at the Czech National Film Institute, FAMU in Prague. His work has been shown in over 50 film festivals around the world, including Festival de Cannes and the Berlin International Film Festival. John was recognized for his achievements in cinematography at the 25th Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival, where he was awarded Best Cinematography for his work on feature films Two Shadows and Model Minority. His latest work, Pazzi Panzaroli's Old Henry, also a Western, is the film that we will focus on in our conversation today. So welcome, John. So here we are. And I guess I want to start with very broad questions. I so appreciate you both spending time with us today. And I guess the broadest question that I could ask that hopefully doesn't get an eye roll like, oh, is this where we're going, is simply why cinematography? What is it about visualizing stories that compelled you and hooked you into this role? And Mihai, I'll pass it to you first to respond.
I mean, I still have to remember, but because it started so early, I think I was 15 when I decided I have to be a cinematographer. And it was kind of strange to decide that at that early age, but my father is an actor, and he's a theater actor, so I grew up in the National Theater and then in his theater. And just I remember watching him because he's directing as well. So when I was 15, I think he had a theater play. I think it was Overcoat, The Overcoat by Gogol, and he had 180 light changes in a very small, on a very small stage. So I realized you can do so much with light, and then I got attracted to all the interesting Russian cameras and kind of started from there.
And John, what brought you to cinematography?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like cinematography in general. My father was always into photography, so I feel like I had a camera, kind of, just a 35mm still camera in my hands, kind of at an early age. And we'd always have this thing of like watching slides, because back then it was always like we would shoot reversal. So my father would take photographs. I would take these blurry, weird photographs as a young kid. And, I think the process of sitting down and kind of watching them and kind of reliving these memories was something that kind of just kind of clicked. And then at some point when I was in, I guess 17 or 18, this idea of kind of film school came about of like, oh, I could go actually make movies and learn how to kind of tell stories that way. I remember there was a history teacher and an English teacher in my last year of high school. And I don't know how I convinced them to do that, but instead of writing papers, I convinced them to turn in kind of video projects. So I would convince my friends together and we would just make these god awful short films, but there was a passion there. And then from there kind of being like, oh, this can actually be something I could dive into and learn a lot more about. And so I think when I first went to film school, I just immediately gravitated toward the camera because of my experience with photography. And also I think I'd read somewhere that, if you're a cinematographer, you can work on 20 different short films as opposed to 1 or 2 short films as a director. And so I kind of took that to heart and just tried to get on set as soon as possible.
And how do both of you stay curious in cinematography? Because I imagine, sometimes you're working in a space, and I feel like any job, no matter how creative, can become run of the mill. What are the things that have sparked you or kept you kind of curious or excited about taking on new projects?
I mean, I'm really afraid of being put in a box, so that's why I'm gravitating toward new things, and I'm trying not to repeat myself very often. But I don't know what it is, but it's like I'm equally excited for a small or a big project, or like I feel that you learn so much from every new experience, from every new movie or commercial or TV or anything. And it's like, I think we have such a wonderful job, and like most of the people that are doing this, they're like deeply in love with it. So it's kind of easy in a way.
Yeah, kind of going along that same thought, I feel like now more than ever, you have access to so many different types of work because of just the accessibility of seeing other films or other commercials that maybe kind of 10 or 15 years ago you didn't maybe have the access to it. So I'm constantly inspired by other people's work, by other cinematographers, by other directors. As soon as I see something that's kind of new and fresh, it forces you to kind of reevaluate things and kind of go back into kind of the process you have and kind of work on that a little bit. I know especially in the kind of the commercial world, which is kind of where I've been kind of, before Old Henry, I'd kind of been living in this kind of commercial space for like 5 or 6 years, kind of away from narrative. But so that, I think the commercial space really changes so quickly. And also with all the kind of new formats that are out there, there's so many different formats, so many different lenses. It's like, how can you not just be constantly inspired, I think nowadays, to kind of push yourself and push your craft.
And what is it? So I at this point, you're both accomplished and can select sort of films that you're particularly curious about. What is it that makes you connect to and decide to commit to a project? I mean, I imagine it's a multitude of things. There might be people you want to partner with, that you have the opportunity to, but what are the moments where you feel like, well, this is where I want to focus my time. This is something that I want to do, especially at the feature level.
I mean,
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, John.
Oh, no, go ahead.
It's hard to say. I mean, sometimes you're just attracted by the story and by what you think you might be able to do with it visually. I don't know. I think probably for me, it's like if it's something I've never done before, like it becomes very interesting.
Yeah, and for myself, I mean, I think more and more it's becoming about the story and like I think whatever project, especially if it's going to be a long form kind of feature length, it's going to take up so much of kind of so much of your time and just creative energy. Like that story has to just kind of get you on this guttural, instinctive level where when you finish the script, for me, you're just like, I have to do this project. If there's a question of like, is it the right one? Then maybe it's not. I think the story just has to be there. And then obviously like the people you're working with, too. I think that's a huge consideration because you want to feel like we're all kind of supported as filmmakers with the collaborators that we kind of choose to work with. But yeah, story. I think it comes down, story.
So I want to get us to the Western, and Westerns are less usual these days, but are considered one of the great genres in film. What is it that has intrigued you about the Western? Mihai, I know you mentioned like not wanting to be in a box, so perhaps part of it is also trying to try new things and engage with new stories. But what compelled you about the Western, and then specifically about these projects? These are. We will talk so much today about how different these are, even though they sit within that broad umbrella of the Western. But what was it about these projects and engaging with leaving your own, indelible mark on the Western that intrigued you into telling these stories visually?
It's one of. I mean, it definitely fit all the descriptions for me because it was. I've never done a Western before, and also I think, and I might be totally wrong, but I think every filmmaker deep inside, we all want to shoot a Western at one point. I mean, such a fascinating genre, and like I think you still have a lot of freedom. It's like you're not. There are so many great examples, and like you can go in so many ways. It's not restrictive. Plus, I mean, for me, it's also like John said, like it's also about the team and your partner in crime, which is the director. And after I had that, I had a pretty quick meeting with James Samuel, and like he's such an amazing person to be around and to work with. Like I realized in the first 3-4 minutes that we'll get along and will be an amazing project. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a Western, is something that there's something just I don't know. There's just it's such a cinematographer's kind of dream, really, right? Because you got these films that take place with these just expansive landscapes, and this just kind of. So I think some of those early Westerns and even contemporary Westerns are some of my more favorite kind of films. They can be kind of action driven, or they can be slow, kind of contemplative. They can be kind of all things. But just visually, it's like I feel like the Western genre is one that there has to be a it's just a visual medium. Like a lot of other genres. But I think the Western genre is such an interesting thing to kind of take on, because every kind of 10 years I feel like there's like a new version of the Western, or like every kind of Western is a product of every Western before it, kind of like horror films to some degree, but Westerns really are kind of reinterpreted by different generations all along the way. And I just found it fascinating, kind of doing some of my early research, was that it's this genre and this type of film that came about. I think some of the earliest Westerns were turn of the century, or like, 1920s, where you actually still had gunslingers participating in the writing of these Westerns, these early Westerns. So you would have gunslingers that would maybe even participate in bank robberies back in the day are now playing bank robbers in these early kind of silent motion pictures. Which a lot of them, we just know that they were made. There's no, they never survived. But it's just really interesting to have a genre kind of always looking back at itself, sort of. It's like it's a part of everything that's come before it, from those early kind of American Westerns, and then the Italian Westerns, and then getting reinterpreted back into another, American Western. So I think you're putting on really big shoes when you kind of like, you have big shoes to fill when you step into a Western, to kind of, you owe it to the genre, I think, right? To say something, whatever that is, whatever you choose to say, you definitely have to have a voice. And so I think that's why it's attractive as a cinematographer, because we're always trying to put a voice on something, visually.
And what compelled you to work with Potsy? Like, how did that connection made, and what's made, and how did you guys sort of hit it off?
Yeah, Potsy and I had done a television series like 3 or 4 years prior. And so I think, having done that television work, there's the episodic, he had always been trying to figure out what his next kind of move was, or what his kind of first feature would be. And so when he sent me a Western script, it was like, absolutely, this is going to be great. He sent me one, and then when he was scouting for that one, he actually kind of discovered this property that he then wrote another film about, which was Old Henry. So he was actually scouting for a different film, and then fell in love with this property and how kind of tucked away it was, and kind of wrote a film around the location.
So I want to get to the clips, but right before we start looking at some clips, and that's where we'll spend the majority of our time, how do you visualize, or what's your pre-production process like? So the story, who you're collaborating with, perhaps you're getting familiar with the specific location. What is your process to know that you and the director are seeing the same thing? What is the sort of dynamic between those relationships, and what are ways that you found yourself continually like preparing for a shoot? Do you look at a lot of references? Do you bring in references that are filmic or from other areas of art? What is that process leading up to production for each of you? And maybe John, we'll start with you, because I feel like The Harder They Fall becomes kind of like a variation upon the Western. So we'll start traditional and then move out to The Harder They Fall.
Sure. Just because our script is essentially it's a family. It's a kind of it's a father-son story at its heart. It's a father trying to kind of protect his son, and so just always trying to be true to the authenticity of what that would have been like to live alone, isolated at that time period. And our film kind of takes place at 1906, so right at the tail end of kind of the Western, kind of the idea of a Western genre, or like as things were getting more industrialized. And so I just immediately kind of surrounded myself with this photography from the turn of the century, from all the way from the 1880s Oklahoma through the 1900s, and just tried to sit with that. For about a couple of weeks, I was just down this rabbit hole of research, and just kind of trying to look in and just kind of feel what life might have been like. How kind of tough, how kind of gritty, how kind of just tough it really would have been like. And so from there, I think that kind of morphed into some more kind of films. And I would share these, obviously Potsy and I, we would share these kind of photographs back and forth. But yeah, there were a couple photographers that did this, like, they were French photographers. They did this like French survey of the American West. And some of these portraits that they did were so just, for lack of a better word, authentic, or it cuts through everything. I've been a fan of Edwin Curtis, who is a photographer who captured a lot of Native American stuff, but his stuff seemed a little bit more polished, whereas these earlier photographers, there's just something about it that really struck me. It was like haunting looking at these photographs. And I wanted to kind of do justice to what that might have been like to live in that time period. And so that kind of informed a lot of our lens choices and formats. And then we shared some other kind of more contemporary references back and forth. We knew we always wanted our guns to kind of be very dangerous, be very heavy. So we looked at films like Open Range for that. I feel like that was a film that we really referenced a lot. And then we actually referenced Hostiles and The Assassination of Jesse James as well. So those are kind of two films that they just treat the violence in a way that felt true to our story or what we were trying to do. So those are some of the more contemporary examples. But then within that, we would try to like do things, you know, like some of John Ford's framing and stuff like that, or the way John Wayne would, you know, hands a gun off to someone in Rio Bravo. Like that was something that Tim Blake Nelson brought to the table. So we're always trying to put these kind of Western tropes kind of within that, you know. So it wasn't a complete revisionary or revisionist Western, you know, trying to kind of stay grounded to some extent in some of these ideas. So yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, as you know, Mihai, like just researching a Western's fun. That's almost a reason to do a Western right there. It's just, this is an excuse to go watch a bunch of films, like to live in that Western world for months on end. You know, that alone is the reason to do a Western, just to watch all those movies.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
For us, it was. I mean, it became very clear from the beginning that we're kind of in like an uncharted territory a little bit, and like not like we really wanted to try to find ways to pay tribute to the genre itself, but like the first idea was like we need color saturation, and I remember James brought these amazing references, which are paintings like Kadir Nelson's paintings, and like just watching those images, like you realize right away, it's like if extra color saturation is like here, like he wanted to be like 200% over that. So it was a little bit of everything, as John was saying, like yeah, watching Westerns and like trying to find steals from the era, and but on top of everything, trying to find that balance, like trying to see how much you can be creative, forgetting about certain things that have to be precise time-wise. And like I remember joking with Martin, our production designer, and he was like, yeah, if it's cool, it's like it can be off a few decades, but it's a process that I think every cinematographer enjoys, because if you have enough time in prep, and like it's a struggle that like looking back at it, I think it's like kind of enjoyable. Like I remember John, I was listening to one of your interviews when you're like talking about the struggle in finding the right lenses, and like it's so interesting how like we all go through the same things, and we all have our moments where it's like, oh, is that the right decision? Like but it's such an enjoyable part of the process, because when you start shooting, it's like you better be prepared and like open to new ideas and things that will come your way. But it's hard, and every project, it's hard to say that like every project has the same process, it has the same prep process, but it's something that is great. It's like solving a puzzle, like trying to put everything together and trying to see what works for each story.
And did you find with James, because he had previously done a film in a similar style, or with a similar, building out kind of like a similar world, and I mean, was it about continuing the exploration of that, or was it? I also feel like there's so many references within The Harder They Fall that fall way outside of the Western genre. You know, it is really a bringing together, a dynamic bringing together of various styles. And so were there other areas where you're reaching beyond the genre of the Western.
It's interesting, and that's why I enjoyed working with James so much, because like of course, like, and I told him, like, he had way more experience by doing that Western short film, but I really felt that we started from zero, and it was a truly collaborative process, and trying to figure out together how we make this work. Um, but it's great. I mean, there were a few moments where, like, I think initially he didn't even want me to look at it, and then then we spoke about it, and it's great. It's such an interesting process when the team works, and when everybody goes in the same direction.
I'm momentarily distracted, John, by the cowboy Mark trotting around outside the window, which this is an actor that you've clearly paid for this interview.
So funny. I feel like ever since he made a set visit to Old Henry, he's been completely obsessed. Yeah, so it's no stopping. No, it's a thing. No, my son wears a button down to school every day with tucked in with a big old belt buckle. Yeah,
it's amazing. So let's start looking at some clips. I'm sure it's going to spark a lot of conversation, and I also just want to encourage, it's a conversation, so please ask questions of one another. I think it's always going to be, it's almost more interesting also hearing you guys pick each other's brains. The way that I had it is we have the opening from Old Henry, so we'll start watching that scene, and then we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll just kind of keep time and move us along, and we'll look at quite a few clips and then wind out. So if we could start with the Old Henry opening.
Look at me. Where'd he get to? Where'd he get to?
So that clip makes me think of quite a lot of things. Also, we just missed some horrific violence, which I feel like is in 95% of each of these movies. And I was sort of like, I actually found myself really shocked in a way that I wouldn't have been in the 90s or the early 2000s. It's like we've almost reached this like other point, I feel like, in film where we see like a lesser presence of violence in film. Maybe not in horror, but you know, in certain areas. And then I was reminded of how crucial and critical that is in the Western, especially with the sort of latitude that we have to tell those stories almost more in a more harsh reality now. But I think that'll be something that comes up with some later clips. I do want to just ask, there's a story that begins this story in Old Henry, right? There's sort of its own sequence that kind of sets the stage. We haven't met our protagonist just yet, but you're in an opening always establishing the visual language of a film, right? We sort of start to make a deal with you on like, okay, this is how this is going to look, this is how it's going to feel, and that's going to repeat and evolve along the way. What are the decisions being made in an early, how do you think about the first couple minutes of a film as being something maybe a little bit different than how you would engage with a later scene? And also, you know, how do you maybe work in iconic moments which are equal parts how we come across the first figure when the camera, you know, tilts down, we see this sort of, you know, perfect frame and this figure and this moment that then sets the story off. But then we also start to get to a lot of these wides that are these iconic kind of quintessential wides in a Western. So that's a very long meandering question, and you can answer any part of it that you'd like, but I'd love to hear how you sort of engage with visualizing the opening of the film.
Well, yeah, it's so interesting that you kind of say like, you know, these iconic ideas, but, you know, on some level, you know, that shot of the, you know, the three horsemen on a field, at some point, that's just three characters in a field. But because they're on horses, because there's certain things, it becomes this kind of iconic kind of this idea of a Western, like this big wide frame. But in the reality, it's like those are the actors in the scene happen to be on horses, you know, in a very big wide shot. You know, it's so it like because of the elements, it kind of becomes something, which is interesting. I mean, in terms of the very opening, originally we were trying to find like a creek bed to have this kind of like this kind of stillness, or sometime like a river or like a, you know, a brook or something to kind of have this stillness of nature. We wanted a couple nature shots and then that to be interrupted by someone like falling into it. We never quite found that, and we knew we were going to maybe add that sequence to like the end of the schedule. But then when we were shooting that kind of in the woods, him kind of racing and running around the boulders and stuff, I think even my camera operator was just had the camera pointed up, and then he was like rebalancing because we shot 95% of our movie on a movie, and so I think he was rebalancing it and adjusting it, and he was just kind of, he just tilted down before we were going to do another take, and the director and I just looked at each other and said, "That's it." We're like, "That's the opening right now," and then that actor was just standing there because he was just lining up ready to run. And so we kind of did it twice, and that became the opening shot, literally because we were just there running out of light at the end of the day, just trying to figure it out. But we were just like, oh, wow, this is the opening. It's going to be the slow tilt down. You're just going to be standing there. You're not sure what's happening, and he has a gun in his hand. So that was something we had a totally kind of different initial opening kind of few shots in mind. And then we ended up not needing to get those because we were so happy with just this happy kind of this thing we discovered, you know, in the moment. And that whole sequence was shot in one day. We shot the stuff up on the hill kind of more at sunrise. And then after, you know, and the rest of the stuff was, or the stuff at the tail end of the day was that stuff in the woods where it was darker. But yeah, that was a combination. On that day we used, I think we had you know, crane, Movi, we had a pursuit vehicle for getting him running down the hill. So we're just kind of everywhere on that day. But we just knowing, going into the film, Potts and I always wanted to kind of just be restrained. And so if there's a way to tell the story in fewer shots and let things play out. We just thought that maybe that was a way for the audience to really start to feel the environment they're in, feel the story, and not kind of be forced into feeling anything for the cut. And so we really tried to kind of be as minimal as we could with the amount of shots. And I think what enabled us to be successful with that is that we had a lot of time shot listing on the location. You know, we probably spent 2 or 3 weeks, just him and I, and no one else around, just kind of going through and trying to map out all the different ideas for all these different shots. And so I think having that, and then having the confidence of us having that time together, we were able to, on the day, kind of be fluid, change things, but we knew where we were going and we knew we'd be covered because we kind of had the edit, or at least what we thought would be the edit, you know.
Yeah, I'm on mute.
Yeah, I can talk.
And so the one other question that I have around that sequence is, it feels like you're responding to so many of the things that are in the space itself. And one of the things that I noticed is, especially in the scene on the hill with these dried reeds, there's ways in which, you know, these characters are disappearing in and out of that space, that the actual landscape kind of like fully swallows up this figure who's running around at some points, and obviously that comes up in a later scene. How do you interpret the environment, right? I mean, the environment gives you so many challenges, but also so many ways for us to reveal, follow, point, you know, without the camera or the cut having to do all that work. For us to see a character disappearing into reeds, oftentimes we could do that sort of a thing with a series of shots, but to allow that to happen within a wide is sort of unique. So is that stuff that's kind of happening organically on set, where you just start seeing how the blocking is engaging with the space, or is that intentional in the planning out of, like, you understand that environment, you've built that out with Potsy, and then it's kind of looking to make sure those moments happen?
Yeah, I think that came from discovery during our prep, you know, and knowing that we had this one large property, this like 3,000 acres to kind of figure out where things were going to happen when. And so, you know, there were a couple different versions of that opening sequence that we had scouted out. And then ultimately we just kind of, you know, you put things, you say, what are the pros and cons of this action happening in 3 different places? And then you go, okay, what's the most visually interesting one? Or what is the one that, you know, works for this, but then something else will work for that. So it's really kind of piecemealing it together, but that discovery process within the actual environment, within the location, and then there's also the collaboration with the actors, because they come in and have ideas, and so it definitely kind of changes. I think, you know, everyone adds adds value to it, you know, in terms of what the overall kind of image, you know, or sequence is. But it definitely would start with kind of the environment and saying, oh yeah, there's this field of grass here. Let's do this, because Potts and I would be like, we haven't quite seen a sequence like that before. We've seen something similar, but maybe this is different. And so we'll do our version of it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, a lot of it was just reacting and trying to get the most kind of visual landscape, you know, or scope, I guess, too, right? Because we're a small film. And so there's limitations with that. And so whenever we could kind of try to get these big vistas and these big frames, you know, we would.
Mm-hmm. And maybe a shorter question, and this is maybe something for the next few clips, but horse blocking. It's one thing to work with people. I feel like horses are beautiful and incredibly awkward and large creatures that don't quite turn on a dime. So how is that something incredibly challenging to work with? Is that something where, to your point before, John, it just kind of does it itself in some ways, because you put a horse at the top of a hill and shoot wide, suddenly you're already achieving so much of that Western iconic look? What were the challenges there? Because you both had lots of horse actors in your films.
Yeah, I mean, someone once said, like, oh, what are some of the challenges, you know, or what were some of the challenging days? And I just, you know, I'm reminded that every day is a challenge on a Western, because you have all all these things that are on the call sheet, like guns, special effects, horses. And so, I mean, for us, we were really, one of the decisions that the producers made early on was they brought a lot of their horses from Oklahoma to Tennessee where we shot. And so these were all horses that had been in films before. And so, yeah, and the horses, I mean, we had just really great wranglers. And so it was a learning curve, I think, for everyone, and we tried to build a schedule out where it's like, it's not, you're working with one horse at a time. And then maybe the next couple of days you're working with 3. And then, you wait until you're 3 or 4 weeks in to have a scene with 7 horses, so it's just a process. But yeah, there's definitely that kind of idea of like, we want the horses to do this and stand right here. But it's not quite happening, and using tools like the Movi, we could be flexible. We weren't laying dolly track and then having to like, get the horses over 3 feet. We could kind of adjust our camera quickly if we had to. But yeah, definitely was times where, I don't know, Mihai, I'm sure you've had this as well. It's tough, and you just kind of shake your head sometimes, and you're like, well, we're going to do that again because the 2 horses are now like rubbing each other's heads together, and while people are arguing or having this heated conversation, and then you're like, the horses look ridiculous now, because but yeah, it's just trial and error, and just kind of roll the camera and hope, and then if you get, I guess, if it falls apart, then okay, we're gonna have to do some close-ups to get us out of here, and it all can't play out in a one or 2 shot, so I think you kind of have to be adaptive that way and kind of get yourself out of things if these large animals are not doing what you want, when you need them to.
So with that, let's look at another wonderful horse actor being ridden by other wonderful human actor, John Majors, in our first clip from The Harder They Fall. This is a clip of Nat Love riding into Douglastown, and then we'll talk a little bit to Mihai about how he shot that. So Mihai, just talk to us a little bit about how much of the end product of that scene is in mind when you engage with it. I mean, obviously there's such strong music choice throughout the film, and that really becomes like 50% of almost all of these scenes, especially these like riding into town scenes. So how aware are you of that, or is it really just kind of, we're building this piece now, and then it's it's a collective project, and eventually it'll be responded to later points in the process?
No, there was one thing that attracted me to this script for sure, because it had so many music notes, and later starting working in prep with James, I realized how much music is a part of his process, and like. It's very interesting. I was trying to find similarities. Like for me, I'm a huge fan of still photography, and like I'm using still images. I find it easier to explain an idea by showing somebody a still image than trying to find the words for it. And I realize now, after working with James, that like music and imagery, like it's either painting or still photography, they have this amazing quality of transmitting emotions right away without like going too many ways about it. And like I remember watching references or even watching playlists, he would play music or like you always have a guitar somewhere, like you play music on set. So quite a lot of it we knew, and if I remember correctly, we had a huge speaker there when Matt was writing in town. So and what that does, not only that, like it communicates emotion, but it gives you the rhythm, which is a huge plus for all these scenes, because everybody realizes what the intention for the rhythm in the scene. That particular location was great because one of our biggest challenges was to find a way to differentiate these two tones, and we came up with this idea that Redwood needs like a really glossy look, and it had a lot of street lights, and that allowed us to like overdo it when we did that for night, while Douglastown should be lit by fire barrels. And with that concept, if you add a wet down and mud, all of a sudden you have two distinct looks, even if it's the same. Pretty much they could be very similar. Going back to horses, yeah, that's an amazing thing that you learn while doing the Western. And like I was amazed. I was expecting it to be way worse, and but like yeah, and on the other hand, like you're having certain expectations, and you spend time trying to figure out. When we had another scene in the opening of our movie with Pickett and Beckworth with the Crimson Gang riding, like we came up with all these shots and like trying to fit everything in the schedule, and realize without realizing that like the horses will definitely need a break, especially after galloping for so long. And you're thinking, it's like in my mind was like, oh yeah, somebody would go on the horse in that period and just kind of ride for 6 hours, and nah, it wasn't exactly like that. It's like you cannot actually do that. They need to drink, they need to eat, they need to rest. But like we as well had amazing wranglers, and we learned so much out of it. And if you have an open mind, and like try to like when you don't have things go your way or the way you thought they will, adapt, and sometimes you might have things might come in a different way, but way better.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how, back in the day, I feel like a Western filmmaker, Western actors, that's what you did consistently, right? So you really had this deep knowledge of that's the type of movie I make. And especially as cinematographers, you both find yourselves jumping to different styles. That's part of what's exciting about the process. But it means that I feel like a lot of directors want to do that. Very few feel successful. Obviously, Kubrick did that. Yorgos Lanthimos is sort of doing it now, like this ability to take on these very different genres, but their voice is so clear that it kind of resonates through all those genres. But as a cinematographer, that's actually sort of a run-of-the-mill experience. If you're able to work and jump onto different projects, is that you wind up dipping your toe into all these different places. And that means that there's such a steeper learning curve when you're engaging with something like a Western. If you're trying it out for the first time, it's not as if that's what you've been doing for 20, 30 years. And so how the horses work, how the light works, how the whatever, all the gunplay is like out of control in these movies, and actually the process of watching that choreography and dance is so different than what we see when we see gunfights or other action sequences, right? Because it feels really specific to the tools. John, you were sort of talking about that as well, about like the weight and the heftiness of the guns and the artillery. If you could just both talk a little bit about, those sort of decisions, how does maybe starting with you, Mihai, like, how does the weight of these objects, these physical things in the room, whether it's the horse or the clothing, or how does that dictate how you shoot things and the desire to show those processes? Because even in that first shot in Old Henry, or the first sequence we saw in Old Henry, we see the site, the site comes up. We learned that's what the site looked like at that time in that moment, and that's how that worked, right? And so there's so much that we learned by jumping back in time and engaging with technology that hasn't existed, that predates this moment. So how does that influence how you shoot things?
I mean, it does. What I feel that, I'm trying to do it, and I have fun doing it with other projects. But Western, I think, just doing prep, working with the props department is so important, and seeing what the options are and seeing how things are working, because you get so many ideas. Like we had another scene that it's not in the movie. It was a telegraph office, and it's like we spent days trying to figure out how that thing can be, how a telegraph machine worked, but like by doing that, you get so many ideas of how to capture it, and it's like it breaks down to everything, to like rifle scopes or I think the more you are engaged in this prep process with the actual objects and seeing the actors rehearse or going through training, I think the more you get ideas, and like all you realize that your initial ideas might not work, and try to readapt.
Yeah, it's interesting with like the prop department. I almost wanted to call it like at least on Old Henry, I wanted to call it like the artifact department, because I feel like everything that was on the set was just so, a lot of it was actually from that time period, which I'm sure you had as well.
Yeah.
And so there's something about these objects that have been around for hundreds of, 100, 150 years. Like they tell a story. And if you kind of listen, you can kind of tap into that, and they kind of they can inform decisions. So from the guns to like the oil lamps to even these tables, I felt a responsibility kind of these things these objects have had a history. There's been people have lived with these objects before, and so I mean there was this kind of, it just became special to try to really capture that in a really, for us, in a very like our version of what authentic was, and that kind of even goes back to that old photography I mentioned earlier, just about all these things informing you. And it's interesting, on a Western, you have the ability to do that because it's all right there. In other genres or other kind of period films, you might have that. If you're doing a very specific period film, you might have that kind of access, but kind of tapping into that can really inform, and it helps inform kind of a visual language if you're kind of interested in kind of doing that, but yeah, I mean, I've always loved history. I love going to museums. I feel like a lot of that's not, unusual to filmmakers, wanting to, have an act for history and stuff. So to be actual like face to face with stuff and put your hands on it, we actually had this one table in our set that came out of a house in White's Creek that was owned by the James gang. And so there's a chance that this table that came out of this house and was now found its way X amount 100 years later on our set, there's a chance that like some of the James gang would have sat around this table figuring out their next moves. And so that is just like, if there's even 2% that that's true, is amazing, but I think all these kind of artifacts kind of, there's a responsibility to them. And again, with guns, I feel like for us, it was just really important to kind of show the heaviness of the violence, and that it was a really violent time, because our main character the whole time is trying to shield his son from even getting involved in even target practice, trying to shield him from that and kind of moving out of that way of life. And then working with really amazing armorers and amazing just kind of, I think, set safety. I think it'd be kind of a miss to not kind of mention that, just as we talk about a Western and safety, it's just important to work with really, really qualified people and really great producers that support those decisions.
Yeah, 1000%. And I think we all know that more than ever now, and recognizing that for whatever reason, it feels, maybe it's because it's that oldest version of action or of this sort of storytelling where safety feels more prevalent. Maybe it's also because so much of it is more practically done, you know, and that requires even more attention to the real stuff. It's like, no offense to Marvel movies, but you know, if you're in front of a green screen, or if you're in like a space where all the effects and all the senses of danger are going to be animated in later, it's a different scenario. But then we need to recognize that when we're on set and we're working with historical artifacts and also real weaponry, it's, you know, safety is the priority. Let's return to a clip with from Old Henry. Let's go to the Henry finds Ketchum sequence and go back into the world that John visualized.
Whoever it is knows what he's doing. Cover his tracks as good as anyone I've run across. If it weren't for this rain, I'd have found him sooner.
I don't need you to speechify the inner workings of your half-wit canine mind. I need to know where he's headed.
Well, that don't exactly narrow it down.
So what I think about when I look at that clip is how, I mean, how stoic Westerns are, how little dialogue there often is, because these manly men say two monosyllabic words to each other, and then we move on into like a series of action-based shots. So there's so much responsibility on the camera to do the storytelling. In that sequence, you have rain, you have a wildly unpredictable space, because all this stuff that I'm sure gets moved around every time you move, it makes all sorts of noise and it's hard to make the camera invisible. What are the challenges there? And also, what's the onus or the responsibility that you wind up feeling to kind of tell the story, because the dialogue is not going to do that for you?
You know, it's interesting, right? When you kind of come across a scene in a script and you know, it's basically someone like hiding from someone else, you know, and it's like, how do you go about visually kind of making that as interesting as possible with the environment that you have? I think originally this was, you know, the idea of this was kind of more in a wooded area, you know, kind of that more kind of way what we're used to seeing, where they're like kind of hiding amongst trees and things like that. And so when we were kind of doing our initial scouting, coming across this field, it was just one of those things that we kind of Potts and I just kind of discussed, like, should we do this, you know? And we both kind of took turns ducking into the weeds and seeing like, wow, you can actually disappear. And then kind of, but then there's the challenge of how do you kind of show that visually and bring the audience on that journey as well. Because I think that's the key, at least for you know, and kind of what we were doing. It was just like, we wanted to really kind of make the audience feel as if they were like in those weeds, you know, and what kind of tension and what kind of drama, you know, what kind of conflict that created. I know initially, I think even there was some score in that, and then at the final mix, they actually took out some of that score, so you could kind of hear the footsteps, you know, of the fields, of the grass and stuff like that. So yeah, it's interesting what you said. It's like some people mumble some words and then it's like immediately just a visual story, this cat and mouse game, you know, and how do you keep that interesting? You know, there's so many different ways in which you can do it, I think, you know, from kind of keeping things in more of a one perspective, or you can shift it around with, you know, with editing and kind of show multiple perspectives. But yeah, that sequence was one of those that we were just really excited to kind of stumble across when we were doing our scouting and our shot listing. And then, you know, it's one of those things, then like 2 months later, you're shooting it, and then you know, the director and I just looked at each other like, well, we did it, it's over now, you know, like I hope we, you know, enjoyed that process. Because, you know, there's probably 3 or 4 scenes in that whole film where we were really just so excited to do it. And then you get there and you shoot them and it's over, and you share it with more friends, and you have more, you know, you have a lot more crew with you. And so you're trying to just like do justice to it, you know. You're kind of trying to make sure you visually capture that initial moment or that initial instinct that you had on set when you, you know, director and cinematographer kind of discover something when like no one else is around, and you're like, okay, this is how we should do it, you know. And so you want to stay true to that as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, you know, as you tech scout, as you on the shooting day, there's just more people involved. And so trying to stay true to that initial instinct, I think, and trying to capture what you guys, you know, what you had in mind. Sometimes it's difficult as it gets larger, as more people are around you, you know. Staying true to that, you know, I think is important. But yeah, that sequence is great. and then we knew when our schedule was going to rain on we had, you know, a couple days of rain, and so we just kind of like quickly maneuvered our schedule around, because we're like, if it's going to rain in any exterior, this would be a great sequence for it to do that in, since he's trying to track the guy anyway.
And do you find, you just mentioned about the different options that you're giving the editor, I mean, for you, when you see the film back, do you feel like, you know, that scene can play out from a multitude of perspectives, and there's decisions that will be made later as to whether we stay more with our protagonists or kind of do what happens in this one, which is like a balance, like a cat and mouse back and forth? Or does it feel really clear to you what the sequence might be? I mean, do you find yourself feeling like you're giving a menu of options that could be interpreted by the director and editor later? Or do you feel like a lot of those decisions of how it will play out have been established so that you're really shooting for sequence in the film?
Yeah, for us, we're on such a limited kind of schedule. You know, we shot in 21 days. And so the director was very confident in the edit that we were kind of capturing, you know, on the day. And so there's certain sequences that get massaged in a certain way, but for the most part, there was no real, I mean, I felt very confident that like what we shot is there, and the way we kind of initially imagined it, for the most part, is there. Like, for example, even in that last clip, there's some dialogue that happens with Stephen Dorff, Ketchum's character, and we're in the weeds, you know, and we see that dialogue. I don't even think there's any other coverage of that dialogue. So much so that I think the producers were even like, are we going to get that over here? And we're like, no, it's going to play out from this perspective, and we don't have time to like go shoot that as well. You know, because again, we were kind of limited. We had one camera in like 21 days. So, you know, we were kind of, but all that prep, I think, allowed us to, you know, all those kind of decisions during that prep process, you know, gave us the confidence on the day that, you know, to go out and just kind of try to facilitate it.
So we're going to move into looking at, people do talk in these films. And so we're going to look at 2 conversational scenes that I think also have a lot of visual language built into them, so that yes, there's a conversation happening, but there's something much more happening underneath all of it. And so let's start by going back to the world of The Harder They Fall and look at Nat and Bass's scene in Mary's saloon.
Excuse me. So how you plan on taking me in, Marshal? Staring me to death?
How about just death? Kiss a pipe.
Man. Never known you to touch it.
Only out there killing men. Or before. I was on the trail of Crimson Hood gang, kind of a bank robbery in Kansas City. Turned out somebody got to him before me.
You know, I don't rob banks, Marshal.
Bet you robbed them to do, which is all the same to me.
Texas.
What?
I was in Texas at the time of that robbery.
How you know when it took place?
Whenever any bank robbery took place, I was from Texas. Unless, of course, the robbery took place in Texas.
Well, I hear it. Some of them boys with the Crimson Hoods, part of a new Rufus Buck gang. That.
Rufus and Yuma.
Yeah. But you knew that already, didn't you?
Now, why you sitting here monologuing, drinking up my whiskey when you should be out rounding up your little deputies, Marshal?
Because he's been pardoned, man. Rufus Buck been absolved of his countless depredations. But seeing as how I've been scouring the terrain looking for bank robbers and such, that particular piece of news failed to reach me.
What they say?
Something about guns. Kill it.
Mary, why you let that little kid take my gun like that? What kind of stupid rule is that? Should be 4 guns pointed at.
Shut up, Pickett.
You shoot, he dead. You miss, all y'all die.
First of all, just like calling out the incredible cast in this film. It's like John Majors, Stancy Beats, Delroy Lindo. I mean, everybody's so stellar in it. And I think part of what's such a gift in this film, especially when you have a conversation scene, is how quippy and punchy the dialogue is. I mean, the dialogue is so playful. There's so much wordplay that's entertaining to watch it. And I imagine one of the things that can be, maybe it's not death for a cinematographer, is just 2 people sitting at a table talking to each other for too long. How do we make that visual interesting? How do we make sure it's a moment where folks stay kind of visually engaged? So Mihai, how do you look at it? How do you plot out a scene like this that has all these, extras and background talent around, big set, but also is a smaller conversation? And what are the decisions that you make to make sure that the way that the shots play out, it reflects kind of that tension and quippiness of the dialogue?
I mean, one amazing thing that happened is that we had time to rehearse this whole scene before. It was a real location, but it was a pretty big rebuild of this space. And I remember rehearsing it and thinking about it, like, how can we make it interesting? And then just a few days later, after the rehearsal, we had the art department sketches coming in. And we realized very early on that, like, the more we can build our lights into the set, the easier it will be for everybody and the more interesting. So we retrofitted all these like oil lamps and petrol lamps and like chandelier with oil lamps, and ran all that through various flickering sequences through the dimmer board just to have that feeling. But that allowed us an immense freedom just to be able to move around and to choose. Sometimes, like, you're trying to figure out how to capture, you're right, like as you're saying, like 2 people talking while sitting at a table, but that allowed us to change our approach a little bit and go with wider lenses closer just to show the environment in the background. There is something that you learn on a Western. It's kind of interesting that you're always thinking how to pay tribute to the genre, but then you realize that some things will force you into that no matter what, like a cowboy hat or a gun belt. And it's so interesting when you're like not even thinking about it, you frame it the way it looks good, and it's like, oh yeah, I've seen that before. It's a tribute, but you're forced into a certain approach with your framing, which is kind of amazing. It was one of those scenes that, like, I think it's like it turned out way more interestingly visual than anybody thought. But again, it's all about teamwork, and it's a huge shout out to the art department and to everything that's there, because if you have an interesting space, then it will be interesting no matter what.
And if you could talk about just, I mean, we spoke about this earlier in the visual styles of these two different Westerns, and how I feel like with Old Henry, we see something that feels sort of quote unquote true to life, right? Sort of using, it's very dark at that time. You don't have a lot of, you don't have a lot of light anywhere. Where the sun goes down, the sun goes down, in The Harder They Fall, it's just it's so bright, it's so saturated, and it actually pushes us, I think, to a more hyper-realistic space, or something that feels a little bit more surreal. So how did you dance with that? Like, how did you maintain that in exterior spaces and interior spaces, and what freedoms did that give you? I think on one hand, you sharing, kind of reworking the lighting setup so that you have freedom to shoot anywhere, but that also, how does just the overall brightness and saturation of the space give you flexibility?
It was one thing that James told me, and like trying to figure out how to describe this idea to everybody else, and I remember him telling us that the look of it should be like a photograph printed on high gloss paper, and that dictated a lot of decisions. Like one of the things, like you would think right away, like in a saloon, like there should be a ton of smoke from the lights themselves, from everybody smoking, from everything. And we tried that a little bit, and we realized like how much it was diminishing the contrast. And then we kind of slowly tried to push everything and have smoke, but way deep in the background, and just trying to find the right balance. And we realized that it's not necessarily helping us to have a lot of smoke, even if it would be, in reality, it would be there. But I think sometimes it's more important to stay true to your idea and the style you chose. And I think it's still working, even that, like, we struggled, like when we decided to turn off the smoke machines, we struggled a little bit about it, but then watching the monitors, and it's like realizing like how the contrast comes back up when the smoke is gone, we realize we're definitely making the right decision.
Great. So let's jump to a conversation scene in Old Henry, which is the dinner scene. So we'll watch that now and talk to John.
Why? Come on in.
I'm almost finished.
Leave it till morning. Come on.
damn sight easier if I could feed myself.
Be a damn sight easier not to feed you at all.
You and me ever met?
That I'd remember. How long you been a sheriff?
I'll say under 18 years now.
How'd you get your start?
I was a deputy for Big Bill Thompson in Baxter Springs.
Baxter Springs. Baxter Springs, Missouri?
Kansas.
Skinny fella, big ears.
Heavy set. Missing part of his left ear from a drunk miner taking a pot shot at him.
I heard it was a drunk whore.
Oh, you did?
Which part of Baxter Springs you live in?
A boarding house. Under Grant State Station.
What was the landlady's name?
She weren't no lady. She a nasty old cuz named Hannah.
You ever run into a George Crook?
You mean General George? Some bitch dedicated his life to driving the cattle out the territory.
How in the hell did you end up in Baxter Springs?
Well, like every other fool dreaming of easy riches and digging for 10. But I realized there weren't none. Just a bunch of ghost stories about a mine near Smoky Hill River. But then I was broke. Work was hard to come by. I'm lucky Big Bill took a liking to me. I don't know what would have come of me. I'm sorry I jumped your boy before. I woke up in a strange place, didn't know who he was. I was being held hostage in some hideout.
This looked like a hideout to you.
I overheard what he said earlier. He didn't mean any of that.
Yes, he did. I'll give you one hand free. Don't make me take it off.
What farming what your daddy did?
My daddy died when I was 3, up in Kansas. And he did near everything but work the land. I was orphaned at 15.
That's 13 years longer than I knew my folk.
Whereabouts you grow up?
New Mexico.
Which part?
Fort Sumner. Born and raised. You heard of it?
Where Billy the Kid was shot, wasn't it?
Main reason anyone would know it. I was there the night it happened.
How's that?
I was just a boy. I used to make what money I could doing chores for a fella by the name of Peter Maxwell. Same Peter Maxwell put the kid up for the night. Same Peter Maxwell tipped off Garrett and his deputies, Paul McKinney. The kid was holed up there. I was sweeping the stalls, and I saw Garrett walking the house. I didn't think nothing of it. But Billy wasn't in there, not then leastways. Know how I know?
How?
He was barefoot in his shin sleeves cutting the meat off a deer carcass not 20 feet from where I was working. I saw him peer through the barn door, and he saw Paul McKinney on the porch there. He stopped carving, looked me dead in my eye. He said, "Keep your head down. You'll be all right." So Billy went straight to Maxwell's room, realized pretty quick it ain't just Maxwell in there. He called out King S. King S. So Billy spoke Spanish as good as a Mexican. Pat's answer. 2 shots. One wide of the marks and the other one of the chest. That was the end of Billy's kid.
And you've seen it all.
I most certainly did. Saw the kid's body get hauled off too, wrapped in a bloody sheet. Enough to teach me there ain't no life for me. I ought to stop Miss Crancy doing part of it anyway. I knew all it took was a good story for you to cut me loose.
You well enough to stay upright in the saddle?
Not hardly.
I want you out of here.
So I suppose waiting the sun up ain't an option.
If I was alone out here, it'd be different.
But then I guess I'm ready.
Good. Take it. I'll fetch your loot.
Okay, watching that over again, there's so much. I mean, without both of these films are have major reveals across them, and certainly in their third acts. So and certainly that's not where we want to have our conversations today, because we want everybody to enjoy watching the films if they haven't. But it is fascinating to even rewatch that scene again and see how the script kind of drops all these clues and things within it that, you know, you sort of reference back and you sort of see moments that have happened earlier, leading us towards where the film might wind up going. I really love that scene because it's a very similar to how, John, you've been describing how the film was shot. It's a very simple scene in terms of what the shots are, and yet it's also, as a conversation, the kind of scene that could feel stuck in a shot reverse shot, and it isn't. It almost turns the shot reverse shot into a rhythm and builds in that rhythm of action of our protagonist, you know, Henry getting up and walking over and coming back and sitting down and getting up and walking over and walking back. And so there's all these, like, this rhythmic resetting. And it's very quiet and still, which makes sense for the space and the time, but it's also incredibly tense because every action that he's taking feels like so incredibly foolish. You know, he just keeps giving more and more to this guy who to us is clearly a danger. And it's very worrisome because we feel like our protagonist is smarter than that. So we feel almost kind of confused as to, like, what's his plan? What's his angle here? So could you talk a little bit about, again, shooting a conversation scene that in some ways is much simpler because it's just two people in the space, but has this underlying tension, especially because it's an interrogation scene where you can see that Henry is testing Curry all along the way to sort of say, oh yeah, I remember he was a really skinny dude. It's like, no, he's fat. It's like, okay, you know, like trying to catch him time and time again. So how did you kind of orchestrate that kind of silent dance or quiet dance?
Yeah, this was one of those scenes that Potsy and I spoke really early on about. And Potsy had very, very specific ideas. And I remember he called me, I don't know, it's like, you know, during prep, it was just, or even before he even started prep, he just called me randomly. It's like, I think I figured out that scene. You know, we have this big, long kind of, you know, just a large page count. You know, we've got like 8 or 9 page scene, and like, how are we going to make that interesting? Like, how are we going to kind of, and there's so much information that's kind of being relayed, you know, to the audience. It's all important. I remember him just saying, oh, we're going to make it about the gun. Cause I don't think that was even in the original script. I think he had kind of added that just in our prep period, you know? And so I remember him just being really excited about this sequence is about what they're talking about, but it's also about the gun. It's going to be about the gun. It's going to be about how they're moving around the room and trying to make that, make the scene about something other than just the dialogue, you know? So it was just about the dialogue. You're just being told information, you know? And so when it came time to kind of rehearse that sequence, you know, with Scott Hayes and Tim Blake Nelson, it was just it was amazing just sitting back and watching their process of how they were coming to terms with all the little intricacies of that scene. Because you're right. I mean, his decision to like pace or get up and stand behind the chair. I mean, that was a whole, you know, every little bit of action, or every choice that those kind of actors made, you know, enhances that sequence, you know, whether they're standing up or sitting down, you know, because there's nothing else going on. So I always find that super interesting when you're really like, as an audience member, you're trying to grasp onto things to give some type of clues to what's going on, but you're not given a lot. And so those little things become huge things, you know, him taking his hand off the gun, that's a big thing, you know, he's testing him. So this was a sequence early on we knew we were going to have a lot of fun with. We were excited. We were like, just excited to kind of see what these actors would bring to it. And obviously they brought so much to it. But yeah, it's like, how do you make two people sitting at a table interesting? And, you know, and I think that choice to like stay outside the room at the beginning for so long, really challenging the audience of like, I mean, that's a big challenge, you know, you're really challenging the audience right there. Like are you going to stay with us on this? You know, how do we have you at this point? Are you hooked in enough to get like, to be invested in this long shot right now? And it's funny because this is one of those that there were multiple different versions of the edit. And I remember at one point there was this concern of like, is it too long? And so they actually kind of trimmed it. I think they actually trimmed it down, but then it felt longer for some reason. So I remember when Potsy sent me that edit, I was like, I know you trimmed it down, but it feels longer, you know, because I think just certain of the shot choices, like having that really long kind of interrogation moment at the beginning, kind of, you need that to make the other sequences kind of build a rhythm and build a pace. And so it's interesting. That was one of those scenes that, yeah, in post, they were trying to kind of figure out how much they could, you know, challenge the audience, you know. And there's also some other stuff that was cut out as well. So this is a lot of exposition, you know. This was the first time these two characters were really kind of sitting down, talking about their past, and then maybe having some connection or not. So yeah, and that kitchen and that dining room, or that kitchen area was so small. I mean, it was like 12 by 12 or something. It was such a tiny spot, you know. It was one of those, that was one of the rooms in the house that made me, or that helped push master anamorphics, because I didn't want the distortion, but I needed these really wide lenses that wouldn't just make everything go bow on the sides or whatever. So that was one of those things. It was like, how are we going to make this interesting, you know? And ultimately that room ended up being one of our favorite rooms to shoot in, just because the quality of the texture on the walls and what Max and Ruby, our art department, did. Yeah, so it ended up being one of our favorite sequences. And Matty, Where My Gaffer, I mean, he kind of like took a light tile, put it on the wall right out of frame, and did this just DIY, trying to make it, you know, one light do everything. So that was kind of one light for the most part, augmenting our, you know, our wired practical for the gas lamp.
One of the things, I've heard this a little bit about acting, actually. Like, you want to play away from the emotion instead of towards it. Like, you say to an actor, okay, you're angry, be angry in this scene. It's like, none of us ever get angry by saying, like, I mean, aside from the Hulk, like, none of us are like, I'm angry. You know, we are always trying not to be angry. when we're angry, and that's actually when you get the real experience. And in this scene, sort of a different version of that, it's almost like we are not having, we are seeing all the ways that this scene can play out not go unfulfilled, which continuously builds tension. It's like the gun gets placed on the table and he turns his back, and we all run through what that's going to look like, what that's, you know, when Curry grabs a gun, turns around, shoots him in the back or whatever. And that would actually feel, you would let loose of the tension. You would go into an action sequence, but you would let loose of that tension and that pressure. But also it's a less interesting story to engage with. And so I feel like throughout this film, throughout this scene especially, there's this intentional resistance to follow through on all the threats or all those moments. And that continues this like slow pressure cooker that doesn't actually ever fully resolve itself. And I think that's one of the things that's quite interesting about the overall film, is that the question mark around Curry remains there for almost the entirety of the film. You know, you're always like, and that feels really true to a Western. It's like, you never really know if somebody is who they are. And even if they prove to you that they're a soldier, it's like they could be a crooked soldier, right? There's so many ways that those characters could turn around during that time. I also love the cups of milk on the table, because somehow over the course of time, the fact that we drank so much milk in this country is preposterous.
Well, it's interesting because I was watching that and it reminded me, I was like, oh, it reminded me of this, you know, some of our other inspiration, you know, Andrew Wyeth, the American painter. Like, I'd been familiar with him, but then I was like reintroduced almost. And that was some of his, like, the still life that he did on this farm. And so that was like those eggs in the bowl. That was definitely from that. I was like, oh, I want to get this kind of still life in there at some point. And then, yeah, so because we're on a farm. And then I remember, I forgot when in the script or when in the process it went from being like either a glass of water or whiskey to milk, but it just felt right. It was like, oh, this is kind of interesting, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting and weird and wonderful. And it's so interesting that you bring up Wyeth, because even the framing on the hills feels very Christina's world, right? It's like the horizon line is way at the top of the frame, and then we see all of this sort of endless expanse of the field, the dry field, and that's such a archetypical, I guess, North American, because I think that was in Canada, but North American kind of scenic view. I want to get to talking about just the beginning of that selection, where we see, I can't remember the name, the character from the sort of gang who looks through those binoculars, and you make a choice of how we're going to see through the binoculars. Can you talk about visualizing that scene and the decisions you made, and how it played out?
Yeah, again, that's like one of those sequences where you're like, okay, the bad guy's going to go like scout out the house. Like, how do you make it visual? You know, how do you bring the audience along on that journey? You know, and when we were kind of blocking that and kind of figuring out where he was going to be, I just remember like discovering that kind of 180 around him to kind of reveal the house for the first time. Because there's a lot of different ways you can do that, but at that moment, I think that was something we actually, because it was a simpler sequence, we knew where we were going to shoot it, but we didn't get into the intricacies of like the exact shots we were going to do. We always thought it'd be just an over the shoulder. And that's, I think my camera operator suggested like, well, I'll just like wrap around. And Potsy and I were like, well, okay, well, that's different than I think what we thought. But then he did it and we loved it, and it kind of kept us with that character, kind of revealing where the house is in relation to where he is. Because if you just kind of like cut to it, you're not, I don't know, there's something about seeing that whole thing sweep around and then really get a sense of how close he really is to the house. And then, yeah, I think it was just like put the longest lens on with a doubler, and see how weird it can get. I think we'd always maybe plan on doing some type of even more of a distortion, through the binoculars, but it kind of worked. We didn't need to kind of take it any further in post. I think we had kind of talked about maybe a slight vignette or something weird. I might have even put some tape on like the top half of the matte box or something, just to kind of make it a little weird, in camera. But yeah, it was just kind of lived that way. Yeah, and then you kind of cut in and you kind of like experience this farm life, some chickens or whatever. It's like really kind of mundane, but it's you get a sense that Henry maybe knows something's out there, And
Mhm.
that was one of those sequences where we kind of like ran out a little bit of light, tried to pull it back in the grade, but you're just really, really kind of pushing the end of that on the Alexa right there, pushing it as far as you can into that like that dusk / night hour. But yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate, especially the way the distorted look. It just, for me, even though it's not, I mean, what would accurate quote unquote look like, but just the fact that, what is glass looking like at that time? How reliable is a binocular? It's going to give you magnification, but maybe it's not obviously it's not nearly as clear as a binocular we might have currently. And so all of that, those little textures give us a little bit of a sense of like the sort of the hardship of life at earlier times, and the things that might not have been there and created different textures and visuals in the world. For a similar shot, let's look at another clip from The Harder They Fall. We'll look at the Scope POV shot. Great. So Mihai, can you talk to us about, I mean, again, it's like, maybe this is just a quintessential thing that we engage with in Westerns a lot, is this idea of the shotgun or the rifle and the seeing, these levels of field. How did you imagine visualizing that shot? And also obviously the town of Redwood becomes like such an incredible set piece that I feel so familiar with, like, I feel like I know where the general store is in just after watching the film. So how did you imagine that shot playing out?
It was one of those that we storyboarded the whole scene, and when the storyboards came back, it was like a classic POV of the scope, when you have a round image with crosshairs and black around it. And I kind of struggled with that, because not only that I like to play with props, like, for example, like if there's like a magnifier or anything on set, I'll start playing with it and trying to figure out how to come up with something interesting. But I remember that bothered me before even getting to set, and I started a conversation with the props master, and I asked him to bring me as many scopes as possible, including the one that was period accurate. I think it was like an 1870s or something like that. And we tried different things, and what I was trying to achieve is like trying to figure out, like, to look through each one of them and trying to figure out how to capture that experience. And we use the tilt and shift lens just to be able to focus on the image that the scope creates. And amazingly, what they were telling me is that what will be very difficult, even like the more modern scopes, they will have a better glass quality. They won't have the period accurate crosshairs, and they'll have more numbers and stuff like that. But amazingly, the one that was period accurate worked the best, and it was really long. It was like a really interesting looking rifle scope, and we used our longest rods from our zoom lenses and mounted that scope on the camera, and that was actually operating the POV of the sharpshooter. And I think that's really great, and that's something that excites me every time when something troubles you and like you find the solution in the end, and playing with all sorts of optical props as much as possible. And that was the perfect scene. And it was actually in the storyboards we had only 1 or 2 shots, but we loved it so much that we used it like 10 times in the end. And it adds to the tension that scene was requiring.
It's also interesting. I mean, you're talking about kind of working with challenges, and you frame up Delroy Lindo when he gets off of the carriage, sort of with the sun behind him. I feel like this way in which we I don't know, that might be a shot that folks would try to avoid in the past, but then there's some interesting quality that comes from shooting directly at the sun and using the blocking in that way. How did you come across that shot?
We ended up joking in the end because I was talking to James, and we're both saying like there's no such thing that there's like too many flares, and I think we did that. We were like doing so many pushings as well and shooting through flames. So every time we had to come up with something, or first AD was joking, like we'll bring a flame bar, a big light for flares, and we'll do a pushing and it'll be fine. It kind of became, and sometimes like you have certain things that become the language of the movie you're working on, and you rely on those. It was there was our amazing B camera Steadicam operator Dave Kamidis, and we're trying to rehearse with Lindo, just getting all around the horse, and with a Steadicam. As soon as we saw the sun, it was in the perfect spot. I was like, okay, start lower and get us that flare that we all love, and we'll be fine.
So I feel like the best place for us to end with a clip is officially the craziest shot in any of what we've watched in anticipation of this, which is the cable cam that goes from where Rufus, we see him in the previous clip that we looked at, Idris Elba's character, Rufus Buck, is kind of staring out across Redwood, and in this case, we'll start where we began, where Nat Love rides into town. So let's look at this shot, which is pretty incredible. Okay, so I feel like when you look at filmic storytelling, you can imagine people at different moments sort of saying, well, if we could do that, but somebody could never do that. And now here we are, and we see this shot, and it's sort of this incredible shot that, sure, it would be amazing if one could do that, but how the hell would you do it? So, Mihai, how the hell did you do it?
That was a shot that was in James's mind for a while, and we were joking about it. I was like saying, like, is it too much of a show off? And James got excited. He was like, yeah, let's go for it. Of course it is, but it's working. It's such an amazing, it's an amazing tool. It comes with a lot of restrictions, and the fact that you have to allow a few days for rigging and another day for de-rigging and rehearsals and everything. But and we were shooting our interior train scene, which was on the same property, but like a couple of 100 feet away from that set, and they were rigging that. And I remember we got there when we had only 1 hour left of the sunlight, and there are so many things that can go wrong. I mean, it's such an this is the perfect example of teamwork, because there were so many things involved in that, like timing of everything, like from the extras to Jonathan's horse, and like him arriving in the perfect spot and all that. And there are so many things that could go wrong, but like everything was great. I think the only problem, amazingly, the only problem we had was radio and Wi-Fi interference, because it was such a long distance that at one point we kind of got some interference and we were losing focus just for a tiny bit, and then kick back on. And I think we did it in 6 takes, but it was basically having 2 giant cranes, the cable in between them, and removing a huge window from the mansion so the camera could pass through it, and rebuilding that in VFX. It's one of those that it is quite an amazing shot, and like, but until you have all the elements back together, you don't know if you really got it right or not.
Dude, and you said that the window frame itself, it winds up being digitally added in, but is everything else there, or
everything? It's pretty much there. I mean, they had to erase the crane that was behind the church and the cables, of course, but that's why I was talking about timing, because we were also wanted to start really wide behind roofers inside the mansion and end into almost a close-up. So but you have certain weight restrictions on that remote head and cables, so we couldn't we were able to work out with a lightweight zoom. I think it's like 28 to 68, and we're like zooming in slowly, sneaking in a zoom as the camera was going on the cable cam. And if you think about it, it's like not only that, but like you have to stop in the same time, and everything needs to time out accordingly.
Yeah, and even thinking about just the all not your 2 main characters, but everything else, right? The town itself needs to be happy. This is actually in some ways a quiet moment. It feels like a big moment, but it's just a moment of these 2 characters seeing each other. But the rest of the town and all the background talent have to be moving along and living life. Otherwise, it suddenly feels like a set. I guess my feeling is that in Westerns were used for this, but so much there's an element of stunt filmmaking that is true to the Western and is true to certain. I feel like that's also true to horror films, like places where there was room to try and experiment and do things differently. And one of the areas that I feel like you would see that is the showdown, like the moment where 2 people are kind of staring at each other and about to draw, and that this is a similar moment to that. It's like the beginning of the standoff, and I feel like that's a moment to command attention. And I think doing something as spectacular as this shot kind of commands attention in a way that I'm sure previous shots did so in previous Westerns. It's like sometimes there's that room to almost like break the reality. It's like breaking the 180-degree rule. Sometimes we break that purposefully to wake people up to this moment that where something's changed now, or things aren't going to be the same from here on out. So I applaud you for doing that, and I think it's crazy and shows off, and I think it works perfectly for the film. And it's hard to show off in this film because I think this film is so stylized that it's part of the language anyhow. So I would love to, I mean, my ending question that I always have is, I imagine a lot of folks who watch these videos and these conversations are emerging directors of photography, are folks who are getting into the field. And I'd love to give each of you a little bit of space to to pass along some form of guidance or to folks, or advice to folks who might be at an earlier stage in their career. They might be just out of college, they might be shooting shorts and dreaming of shooting a feature one day. And what's something that you've learned along the way, or a piece of wisdom that you've found or you've heard from someone else that you'd like to impart to those folks watching today?
First I want to say, Mihai, like, did you guys set out to make like a whole nother genre within a Western of genres? Because, like, I mean, this film is literally spectacular, and I think watching some of those clips today was just like a reminder of like, wow, like just in terms of really pushing it to a degree that like now I feel like there's another type of genre of a Western, you know what I mean, like within that. So congratulations, like, I mean, you guys really went for it. And I think even that last cable cam shot, it was almost like this deconstruction of like, you know, a snap zoom or something, you know, but in such a visceral kind of way that kind of puts the audience there. So just congratulations, because I mean, I can't imagine what monumental task it was to kind of like grab hold of this thing, you know, and bring a cohesive visual language to it. So yeah, it's great, it's fantastic. Just wanted to be sure to say that.
Thanks.
And then to your other question, Sean, I guess in terms of just starting out, I mean, it's cliche, right? It's like, stay curious, shoot as much as you can. If you want to be a cinematographer, like, there's ways to tell stories, you know. I think you have to find your own voice as early on as possible. I know I spent some of my earlier career kind of trying to facilitate others' voices, you know, but until I feel like I, you know, in the last, I don't know, probably 10, 15 years, feel like I should have a voice. So I think it's like, find your voice. If you're a young kind of emerging kind of film student or cinematographer, you know, have an opinion, have a voice. It doesn't matter what kind of budget level you're on or what kind of limitations. And kind of one of my new mantras lately, after some of the films I shot last year, was like, at the end of the day, you've got actors, you've got a camera, and you have choices. And sometimes there's a lot more choices, and sometimes there's fewer, you know. But it ultimately, no matter what kind of resources or kind of a large kind of crew you have or lack thereof, it's just choices. Where you place the camera, where you place the actors, and who you collaborate with. So I guess it's, you know, I mean, something I constantly do. If I have some time, I reach out to directors that I love collaborating with, and I'm like, hey, let's talk about doing a film just for us, you know. Let's do a film just for us, and then just to experiment, you know. I think that's an important part of building a portfolio and finding your voice, to experiment. So yeah, don't be afraid to experiment and make bold choices, because we've all failed, you know. We've all failed this way, you know, through these choices, you know. It's part of the learning process, I think. I don't know. It's kind of cliche. It's like, just start shooting and then find a voice, but, you know, stay curious, you know.
I think you're right. I think it's like one thing that I'm thinking as an advice, because it's like, I'm guessing don't be afraid of crazy ideas, of your own crazy ideas, and especially don't run from the others' crazy ideas. I found out that, like, it sounds challenging, but like the thing I enjoyed the most is working with directors that will put you in a spot and will give you a crazy task. And it's like, it's an amazing, thrilling experience to try to solve that and try to figure out how to do it. And in the end, it's like, it doesn't sound as crazy. It's like, actually, it's brilliant, and it works so well.
Thank you both for that. I think there's a war of attrition of just staying at it, and, you know, to beat a dead horse, stay on the horse kind of a thing. You know, stay on it for long enough, and know that you can stay curious and you can keep at it. And sometimes it's hard to mark your growth in that short term, but it's always very interesting to look back over the course of those first, 5-10 years out of into the professional sphere, whether you went to college or not, where you start to see yourself honing and finding that voice. And I think that's something about that feels really unique to cinematographers, more so than some other spaces where, as a director, sometimes you're balancing all things and you're working with all departments, but there's something to the visual style of film that is uniquely amazing and uniquely yours, right? It's that idea that you can, no matter how, obviously these two films are stylistically wildly different, but even if you both took the exact same approach to making, let's say, an Old Henry and making something that felt very minimal and very real, they would look wildly different. And that's because you each see the world in a different way. And it takes a while to realize that and to be able to wield that too, right? To see what you're doing and then be able to apply it again and again. So I appreciate those words of advice, and I so appreciate both of you for joining us today and for sharing your work. I encourage everybody watching to go see The Harder They Fall and to see Old Henry, and truly see them together, because it is wild to see those two films back to back and really think about what could be explored in a genre like the Western, or just in genre in general. And I thank Sight, Sound, and Story for facilitating this conversation today. I really enjoyed my time, and thank you, John and Mihai, for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, everybody, for a great panel and for sharing your insights. I want to thank again Mihai Malaimare Jr., John Matyśiak, and Sean Weiner for a great night. I also want to thank our sponsors, OWC, American Cinema Editors, ZEISS, AJA, and Filmmaker U. And finally, look out for our next event with details coming soon. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and have a great night.